The hip. Let's talk about the hip. Diarthrotic classification, ball and socket subclassification. A ball and socket joint is triaxial. It can move in all three of its planes, sagittal, frontal, transverse, and it can rotate in all three of its axes. Okay, the ball and socket hip joint is made up of the femur, specifically the head of the femur is the ball, but the head of the femur is a separate bone. It's just an area. I've mentioned that before, like Louisiana. Acadiana is an area of Louisiana. You know, the neck is an area of the femur, your greater, lesser trochanter, these big bony nubs that muscles can have better leverage yanking on. It's an area of this one bone, okay? And so you have this ball, the head, that articulates inside of this socket. This socket is called the acetabulum. And this socket is made up of three separate bones. So again, you think about where maybe three states articulate, border each other. And so you have the ilium. So this part is part of the ilium. You have the ischium, that's your butt bone, your sitting bone, like that's where your hamstrings attach. But when you sit, it's kind of a bone that kind of it pushes you up. So the ischium is this part, and then your pubis, the front part. Okay, so your ilium, your ischium, and your pubis form the socket. And again, when you're born, it's not fused so that your body can grow. And then once you finish growing, and it freezes up, seals up, forms a nice solid socket for the femur. Okay. Three planes of motion. That means we're going to have to account for 6 types of motion. 3 planes of movement possibilities gives us 6 total motions. Clockwise and counterclockwise are 2 different directions of spin in each plane. The first one should be pretty simple, indofetal and outofetal, right? So we're going to have hip flexion, indofetal, hip extension. All of these that I'm showing you are obvious motion, meaning that it looks like it's moving and it is. Then I'm going to get into the illusion stuff. There's a lot of illusionary motion with the hip, unfortunately, because there's a lot of stuff to hide with clothing, okay? You can't really hide motion of your fingers. It's hard to hide motion of your wrist and the elbow, but when you start to get into the shoulders, the scapula, the pelvic area, you know, it's a lot easier to disguise motion. Now, flexion, extension, sagittal plane, okay? Then if we go frontal plane, we're going ab and adduction. I'm going to get into that more in detail in a little bit. And then finally, when we get into transverse plane, we're looking at internal and external rotation, or medial and lateral rotation. Follows the same rules as the knee. When I talk to you guys about when you bend your knee, and your knee can rotate medial or laterally, externally or internally, same exact rules. Internal, external, internal, external. Okay. Now, the socket attaches to what we call the pelvic girdle, the pelvis. When we get up into the shoulder, I'm going to talk to you about the shoulder girdle, which is made up of several joints / articulations. Same thing with the pelvis. The pelvis is kind of, I like to look at it as the bedrock, the foundation about which your skyscraper or your vertebra is built upon. So this has to be pretty stable. This has to be pretty steady. Your right pelvis and your left pelvis won't move independently like your scapula. like your shoulder girdle. Your shoulder girdle, I can make my right, I can make my left move independently. Here, it's not so much. There's a little bit of play to dissipate force in this area, but it's not like it's going to be like an oyster shell where I can independently do things with them. I need much more stability here, okay? So the pelvic girdle, when I say attaches to the pelvis, that's from the socket's perspective. The socket is part of the pelvis, okay? So the ball and socket of the hip, even though it has 3 planes of motion, which is a lot of movement, the pelvis is designed, or the hip joint is designed more to be more stable than the shoulder. And one of the reasons is because if you dislocate your shoulder, you know, that's a bad day, but at least you can run away from danger. If you dislocate your hip, that's a really bad day. You may not get away from predators. You may not get away from danger if you dislocate your hip. So hip stability, think of it as insurance. Insurance to make sure my hip stays in place is of high priority. So a few things we do is the shoulder socket very shallow, hip socket very deep. In addition, you have these big, strong muscles that cross the hip that add to stability as well. And inside the hip joint, there's even an extra ligament, teres ligament inside the ball and the socket to help maintain stability. So we put a lot of insurance for stability in our hip joint, okay? So it looks like it's moving, and it is. We're going to get into flexion, extension, ab and adduction, internal, external rotation. And then we'll get into it looks like it's moving, but it's not. And it looks like it's not moving, and it is. Okay. So let's first start off with sagittal plane options of the hip. Okay. Here we go. Hip flexion, hip extension, hip flexion, hip extension, getting into fetal and out of fetal from the perspective of your hip joint. Now the illusion where it looks like it's not moving but it is could be if my femur stays still and then I rotate the socket. So in the first one, the one that's obvious, my femur is rotating in a different global rotation than the socket, but locally the same exact angle changes is happening. More in the fetal, more in the fetal. Okay, so this would be like maybe you're doing like a good morning exercise where you're rotating the socket about the ball. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, okay? When it looks like it's moving but it's not is the other hip. Like let's say I'm pivoting or rotating about the left hip and this hip goes along for the ride. So in other words, this hip, the right hip, stays in anatomical position. You rotate about the left hip, you flex with the left hip so that you could pivot. It would look like globally that the hip is extending if you use global references. But from a local reference, this hip stayed in its same position, its anatomical position, okay? I'll get into some examples when I get up and move around, okay? So flexion, extension, okay? Now let's get into frontal plane rotations. This one gets a little tricky. So one of the more common catch-all terms is with ab and adduction is abduction is away from the midline, adduction is towards the midline. And for the hip, that's not a bad, I don't have a problem with that because most people's hip range of motion doesn't get crazy. However, you can fall into a trap because midline is a linear concept. And so for my shoulder, for example, you can really get confused because from anatomical, abduction is away from the midline. But if I keep abducting, eventually my arm comes back towards the midline. So it's common for students to confuse away, 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 towards. Do I switch it? Do I have ab for the first 90 and then add for the second 90? And the answer is if this was a clock hand and this was clockwise, would you have clockwise for the first 90 and then counterclockwise for the second 90? Of course not. You would have clockwise the entire time. Okay? So it's the same thing with ab and adduction, that it's the direction of motion. It has nothing to do with going away or going towards. It has to do with the direction of rotation. And for most people, it works with the hip because you're not going to abduct the hip past 90 degrees unless you're very skilled with flexibility. Okay, so one of the ways I like to look at it is kind of similar to lateral and medial rotation, is in the frontal plane rotating laterally or medially. Or another reference sometimes I'll use is clocks, where from anatomical, going away from 6 o'clock is abduction, going towards 6 o'clock is adduction, initial movement away from 6 towards 6. Because if you think about it in terms of away or towards 6, then if you're going like this and you're going away from 6, 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 12 o'clock is further away from 6 than 11, 10, 9, 8, right? So at least that regard, if you keep it rotational, if you keep rotational markers, then it works. Another thing students get confused about ab and adduction is because those two terms sound so close alike. An example I'll typically give is in growing up, we had twins that I graduated high school with that looked absolutely nothing alike. I mean, you could tell they were brothers, but they were fraternal twins. So they looked different, but their names were Heath and Keith. And so because their names sounded similar, it was very easy to confuse them. You know, hey Heath, I'm Keith. I know you don't look like your brother, but just the names. That's the same thing with ab and adduction. Flexion, extension, two different starting letters, right? Internal rotation, external rotation. But when you get into ab and adduction, they both start with A, and B and D sound very similar. So we need to find ways to make sure you guys don't confuse those two terms. So what I'll typically say is I'll emphasize the B, abduction, and adduction. So it looks like it's moving, and it is. Right hip right hip right hip right hip So that's like if you raise your right leg laterally. So if you think about it, right? Lateral to the outside. Remember how I said with the knee, spin laterally, spin medially? Well, you could raise your leg laterally or you could lower your leg medially. Or from anatomical position, you could bring your leg medial. We'll get to that with the illusion. But lateral, bringing your leg out laterally is abduction, abduction. And then rotating your hip in the frontal plane medially is adduction. Ababa, addada, A-B-A-D, A-B-A-D. So emphasizing that letter, the B or the D, can help you remember, because if you just say abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, you see how close that sounds? It gets very confusing, okay? So right hip abba, right hip add-da-da-da-da. Hey, no footsies. Right hip abba, right hip add-da-da-da. Now, check out the illusion stuff. Check out the illusion stuff. From here to there is the same motion. Watch, I'm going to freeze it and tilt it. A to B. If I freeze it, Look how I'm abducted. If I freeze it and rotate everything to the side, so from A to B is the same as from A to B. This is right hip abduction. So you're like, well, when would you do that? Well, if you pivot, if you keep your leg on the ground and you could pivot your body, you can rotate your hip where the socket actually rotates about the ball. You do that all the time. Flexion, extension, abduction, internal extension. I'll get into that a little bit. But if the ball, sorry, pal, if the ball can rotate about the socket, flexion, extension, abduction, internal, external rotation. This is a left hip socket ball. Flexion, extension, abduction, internal, external rotation. Let me try to flip it for the right. Flexion, extension, abduction, external, internal rotation. If I can move the bottle about the cap, I could sure as heck move the cap about the bottle. Flexion, extension, abduction, internal, external. Do it again. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, abduction, abduction, internal, external, internal, external. So that's where a lot of the illusions come from, is as a reminder, when you reference joint motions globally, you tend to fall for illusions. When you reference motions globally from the room's reference, from the ground and gravity's reference, you tend to fall for illusions, okay? So for the hip, sagittal plane rotation options, in the fetal, out of fetal, flexion, extension. Flexion, extension, extension, flexion, flexed, extended, okay? Frontal plane rotation options, laterally in the frontal plane. So just like right and left can mean two different things in two different planes. I'll give you an easy example of that. Do a cartwheel to your right, do a cartwheel to your left. That's frontal plane, right and left. Spin to your right, spin to your left. That's transverse plane, right and left. So you could use those same terms with lateral and medial. Spin laterally, spin medially. Rotate laterally in the frontal plane or rotate medially in the frontal plane. Okay. Another thing that's important to do is remember what's happening inside the joint. Okay. We got to visualize that inside we have this ball moving about this socket, and sagittal, frontal, or transverse, sagittal, frontal, transverse. Okay. All right. Now, here's where things get a little different. It's that darn transverse plane rotation. So, joint motions are named after the distal segment. I say named after, but in terms of spinning laterally or medially, they are named in it looks like it's moving and it is. That's the easiest way to look at it. Why would you name motions based on illusions? You would name motions based on it looks like it's spinning and it is. So the easiest way to look at that is in our upper extremity, right? It looks like it's moving and it is. Add, flexion, extension, right? Easy. Right shoulder, external, internal, okay? Knee, I took it off the ground so that it's obviously moving. External, internal, external. Our hips, unfortunately, stay on the ground a lot, so it leads to natural illusions, but the motions are named based on the obvious motion. It looks like it's moving, and it is. So for the hip, okay, for the hip, let's see which one is going to give me the best motion. Okay, so for the hip, just like with the knee, hey, right knee, when it was off the ground, it looks like it's moving, and it is. Hey, right knee, spin laterally. Woo. Hey, right knee, spin medially. Woo. Hey, right socket, ball. Hey, right hip, spin laterally. Woo. That's how my hip sounds when it moves too. Hey, right hip, spin medially. Woo. Lateral rotation, medial rotation, lateral rotation, medial rotation, external rotation, internal rotation. Okay, this is a right hip. Right hip external, right hip internal, right hip external, right hip internal. Think of it as having a golf club. And if you had a golf club, as you know, you're going to have like the shaft, the handle, and then the club itself, right? The foot. You think about kind of a putter, right? You hit it, you putt the ball with your foot. So when your foot is in anatomical position, your knee isn't flexed, you can literally think of your leg as a golf club. And you can imagine kind of that foot, let's see, spinning externally, internally. Let's see if I could do this. Lateral, medial, external, internal, external, internal. Lateral, medial, external, internal, external, internal, okay? It looks like it's moving, and it is. Now, the illusion where it gets tough is when it looks like it's not moving, but it is. The ball can move about the socket, but the socket can move about the ball. And the best way to prep yourself for this is that globally, they are going to have opposite spins, but they won't have the opposite spin locally. In other words, internal rotation is going to be when the ball spins like this, but the socket spins like that, the other way. Here, let me try to do it like this. Now we're looking on the top. Internal, Brian. Internal, internal. External, external. Internal, internal. External, external. Okay. All right. So, where illusions are really going to happen, and obviously this would be a heck of a lot cleaner if you could see me do this in real life, but this is where we're just going to have to work together, okay, is to show you these illusions, to show you how your instinct is going to be to, again, globally, you're going to think, if the ball of my right hip rotates laterally and that's external when it looks like it's moving, and it is, then anything that seems to be rotating laterally is going to be the same thing. And that's where I'm trying to get you to not assume. When the ball is moving about the socket and it rotates laterally, then yes. But when the socket moves about the ball, the answer is no. And I'm going to show you the temptation of following the socket's rotation and just assuming that it's the same, but it's not, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my headset down, but I'm going to have the microphone still up. So I'm just going to kind of yell a little bit so that you can hear me. And I'm going to go through illusionary motions. And I'm going to review these with you because the best way to learn it is to do it. Okay? So follow along with me, okay? All right. Let's see. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Right hip flexion, right hip extension. Right hip extension, right hip flexion. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. Right hip flexion, right hip extension. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. Left hip isn't going anywhere. My left hip stayed in its anatomical position. I'm going to try to do it with the hip that's closer to you. Right hip didn't do anything. It stayed in a straight line. It's my left hip that flexed. So again, the illusion, you may want to say that the right hip did something because you see it moving and you're like, whoa. It's like, again, in football, you follow the football. Okay? Frontal plane. Right hip, right hip, right hip, right hip, right hip, abduction, right hip, adduction. Now let's go for illusion. Show you what's happening here. This looks like it's moving, and it is. Right hip ab, right hip add. Now watch, the same motion, but with an illusion. It looks like the leg isn't moving, but it is. Right hip abduction. Tilt your right ear to your right shoulder to see how my right hip is abducted. It is lateral relative to anatomical position. Right hip adduction. Right hip ab, right hip add. So the other illusion is on the left side. It looks like my left hip is abducting if you look at it globally. Hey, look, my left leg is going out relative to ground and gravity. But actually, my left hip is still in its anatomical position. Tilt your right ear to your right shoulder and see how my left hip is still home. So if I pivot on my right leg in the frontal plane, the motion is here and no motion is there. But you got to be trained in human movement to be able to see why. Right hip abduction, left hip nothing. Right hip adduction, left hip nothing. Now, can my left hip ab and adduct? Absolutely, but it's going to look like this. What I'm saying is that it doesn't have to. If the ball and the socket both move the same, then I don't have to have any motion. Okay? Now, here's the tough one. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Right hip external, right hip internal, right hip external, right hip internal.
Left hip external. Left hip internal. I'm going to make a ball because this is the ball moving about the socket. Left hip external. Left hip internal. Hey, left hip, spin laterally. Whee! Left hip, spin medially. Woo! Right hip, spin, get that arm out the way. Right hip, spin laterally. Whee! Right hip, spin medially. Woo! Here's the illusion. Here's the fun part. From here to there, imagine my pelvis looking forward. My leg, my right leg is looking laterally. Like if my toes were eyes, my toes would be looking lateral. Here, my toes are looking forward. It's just an analogy, guys. If I have right hip external rotation, my toes are facing laterally relative to my pelvis facing forward. So A to B, right hip external rotation, gets me the same point as if I keep my femur still, if I keep the ball still, and I rotated the pelvis. Now, this represents my socket. This was my ball. This is my socket. Now I'm taking the socket and I'm rotating it in a different global rotation. But I still get the same local change. Look, my pelvis is now facing forward over here. And look at my toes. My toes are facing laterally because I had right hip lateral rotation. Right hip external rotation gets my toes looking lateral to my pelvis. From A to B gets me to the same point as A to B. Another way to prove that this was right hip external rotation is, how would I have to rotate my hip when it's off the ground to get it back home? I started in anatomical position. I did this. I'd have to internally rotate to go back home. Therefore, I can infer that I had to externally rotate to leave home. Internal rotation of the right hip. External, internal, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal, external. Get it? Left hip, external, internal, lateral, medial, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal. Got it? All right. Now, without the help of the skeleton, this is where it's going to get a little trickier. Without the help of the skeleton, I did obvious illusionary motion, one at a time. Problem is that you can do illusionary motion two at a time. And sometimes your trunk doesn't even globally go anywhere. Your trunk's rotating, but it doesn't go anywhere. So you have a lot of illusionary stuff happening under your clothes. So my job is to get you to see these illusions. Okay? So if I'm standing here and I rotate, remember, my right socket and my left socket can't move independent of each other because the pelvis is fixed. It's one block. It's going to rotate together. Okay? So if I'm standing on both feet and I rotate both sockets at the same time. Now, I really did that when I was on one foot. It's just the other foot went along for the ride. But if I have both feet on the ground and I rotate both sockets, I need you to be able to see that the illusion, the temptation, is to say right hip spun laterally. But that's not what's happening. That happens when I move the femur, right hip spin laterally. When I move the bottle about the cap. When I keep the bottle fixed and I move the cap about the bottle, the opposite is happening. When I move the socket and it appears that the socket is going laterally, actually what's happening is the right hip is internally rotating. Look, here's my pelvis. And if I said, hey, right hip, you start in anatomical position, and then you do this, how would my right hip have to rotate to go back home? Wouldn't it have to externally rotate to go back home? Therefore, it had to internally rotate when I went from here to there. I had right hip internal rotation. And it's an illusion because, again, if you learn external, internal, external, internal from one perspective, your brain wants to use it for every perspective. From A to B is right hip internal rotation. And the easiest way to see it is that I started at anatomical, and now my right hip is internally rotated. And the only way I could go from anatomical to being internally rotated is to have internal rotation. Now let's look at what's happening at my left hip. I start in anatomical position. I do this. Your instinct wants to say left hip must have internally rotated because my left hip's going medial. That's what your instinct's saying. But I'm here to tell you that reality is your left hip is not internally rotating. Your left hip is externally rotated. Look how my toes are looking lateral compared to my pelvis. I have to internally rotate to go home. Therefore, I had to externally rotate to leave home. I started here, where my toes and my pelvis are both facing forward, and I did this. My toes are facing lateral. Therefore, I had lateral rotation. Okay? Another illusion is it looks like it's moving, but it's not. So in the instance, the first ones I gave you where I did this, you could see how my left hip, your temptation is to say, oh, the left hip went lateral. But actually, it didn't do anything. It stayed in anatomical. And the pelvis and the ball went together. So I had no hip rotation when I did this. Now, if I'd have kept my feet on the ground, I would have hip rotation. But I could have my leg in a cast where I couldn't move it if I tried. And I could do this with it. Just going along for the ride. The ball and the socket moving together. I know it's not easy. That's why we got to practice. Okay? Let's do another illusion. Frontal plane illusions. Left hip ababa, left hip addada. Right hip ababa, right hip addada. But what happens when I keep the balls of my femurs fixed and I move the sockets? Okay? Here's anatomical position. If I do this with the sockets, I go from here to there. My right hip has rotated laterally, and my left hip has rotated medially. Check that out again. Start, finish. My right hip had abduction, and my left hip had adduction. Right hip ab, left hip add. Left hip ab, right hip add. And if you're having a tough time seeing it, tilt your left ear to your left shoulder and look at the pelvis from its perspective of anatomical, and you can see how those hips are deviated from anatomical. Now again, globally, it may look like they're doing the same thing. But double doors, if if you think about it from a double door, this is opening the doors, closing the doors, opening the doors, closing the doors. So the hips didn't do the same thing. It may look like it globally, but it's not happening locally. Left hip, ab, right hip, add. And if I come back, my left hip adds and my right hip abs to get me back home. And if I keep going, left hip add, right hip ab. So again, an illusion is if I keep this leg in anatomical position and I pivot about the right hip, it looks like this leg is going out. And it is, but that doesn't mean I had joint motion. It's going along for the ride. Left hip nothing, right hip abduction. Okay? So, I'm going to give you all of the, it looks like it's moving and it is. Left hip flexion, left hip extension. Left hip flexion, left hip extension. Right hip abduction, right hip adduction. Left hip external rotation, left hip internal rotation. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. Bilateral hip flexion, bilateral hip extension. It looks like it's not moving, and it is. Right hip abduction, left hip adduction. Left hip abduction, right hip adduction. Left hip external rotation, right hip internal rotation. Left hip internal rotation, right hip external rotation.
Not easy unless you practice. Got to practice these concepts, okay? In addition, your ball and socket joints, because they have so much movement capabilities, you have a variation of ab and adduction away or towards 6 o'clock or to the lateral, to the medial. And that is when you get out of anatomical position. So think about, in North Louisiana, we have Interstate 20. Down south, we have Interstate 10. Both of them move east and west. I'm giving you a linear analogy for a rotational concept. But you can't move on both roads at the same time. You can go in two different directions. Like if I'm going east on I-10, I guess technically I'm moving east with 20, but I'm not on 20. The only way to go from moving east or west on I-10 to going east and west on 20 is to literally go up to get on Interstate 20, up near Shreveport. So it's very similar. Your body has a variation of ab and adduction in your pelvis's or trunk's transverse plane. And we call that horizontal ab and adduction. But it's just a variation. And you can't do it in anatomical. You got to move. You got to go up first before you can move in your pelvis's or trunk's transverse plane. Here's what I'm getting to. If you had a clock, okay, let's say you had a clock. There's a clock hand, okay? And you have a clock. And the clock is positioned like this, so you see frontal plane, and you say, if this is the right hip, you could say, hey, ab, add, blah, 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 blah. Who cares? What horizontal ab and adduction is you take the clock off the wall, and you lay the clock down like this. And you could say, well, technically, the clock hand can still do the same thing. It can go away from 6 or towards 6, just in a different dimension. But you still have the same concept. So this is what I mean by that, or a different way to look at it. I'm going to use my shoulder but the shoulder's the same kind of joint as the hip. It just makes this concept a lot easier to explain. Flexion, now I'm up on interstate 20, and now I can go laterally or medially, or if you want to use the 6 o'clock, even though I rotated the clock, I'm still at 6. 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock. So this didn't change the fact that I'm still at 6. Away from 6, horizontal ab, towards 6, horizontal add, da, 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 da. Now again, what's cool is that I'm still at 6. I go away from 6. Now I can get back to 6 in 2 different dimensions. I could get back to 6 in the frontal plane, or I could get back to 6 in my trunk's transverse plane. Horizontal add gets me back to 6, and regular add gets me back to 6. And the reason we differentiate them is that muscles, there's different muscles pulling at different directions here, but a variation of regular ab and adduction is horizontal ab and adduction. Add, ab, horizontal ab. So the same thing can be in the hips, okay? So I'm going to get into that in my next lecture. The hip lecture is going to be a 2-parter, all right? So important concepts to take home. Got to get those traditional motions down. Looks like it's moving, and it is. Flexion, extension, ab, adduction, internal, external rotation. Variations, the horizontal, AB and adduction. So you think about if you get into like a machine where you're sitting down and you're doing like the Jane Fonda's horizontal, AB and adduction. I introduced you to illusions, but we're going to have to work on hip illusions a lot more. There's a lot going on in there. So we're going to get into that a lot more in the next lecture that's going to complement this lecture. Okay, illusionary stuff. Again, the reason the hips are easy to miss is because you got a lot of distractions in here, man. And I'm not just talking about clothes. But you know, we got to remember that when we're moving the hip joints, what's really happening, it's almost kind of like you have to visualize what's happening inside. Okay, so rewatch this lecture as needed. Next lecture, we're going to get into some more practice examples of the hip, especially. I might even work in some practice examples of the ankle and the knee. And then I'm going to introduce you to pelvic girdle rotations, how we can talk about from the perspective of the pelvis. Because even though you may be rotating about your right hip, the left pelvis has to go along for the ride. Even though the left hip doesn't move, this bone has to move with that bone. Because again, they can't do like this. Okay, so we give the pelvis perspective of spin sagittally, frontally, and transversely. All right, guys, hope y'all are doing well. We'll see you next time.